Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. I'll just start by saying that you can tell by the date, this isn't the most current of trips. It's sort of a canned presentation that I've given over the years, and it's been well, what, 17 years since I've been there. And I did actually read a book on Antarctic ecology that was published in 2015, and it was pretty shocking to see how much has changed and how quickly it's changing down there. So I do have a number of statistics on populations of things and how they're doing, and that you just have to temper that with, I don't know how it is these days, but likely not that good in a lot of cases. But anyway, this was I talked about this trip being a bucket list. It was the last continent that I hadn't been to, so I really wanted to get there and see what it was. There was still a lot of fewer impacts from climate change. So, okay, at the time that I went, I was living in Ontario, so I started from just showing you how do you get down there. Well, you fly down to Chile, across the Andes to Argentina, Buenos Aires, and then we went down to Ushuaia, which is in that particular thing is close to the Argentina-Chile border, but we were in Argentina, and we took a ship from there. I hope.
Okay.
Yeah, just they're advancing without me. Sometimes they. I'm not sure how to get that back to where it was.
Will there be a control?
Yeah,
here?
there's sometimes. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. You got back.
Okay, it just there was a bit of a delay. Okay, we'll try that again. So yeah, it's quite a long 16 hours in the air, 16 or 12,000 kilometers. It's quite a long trip.
Yeah.
So just a shot from the plane going over the Andes. We had nice clear weather on the flight there. So I went a little bit early because I did want to spend a bit of time in Argentina and before and after the trip. So I did spend a couple of days in Buenos Aires, and I'm primarily a bird watcher, so there's a lot of bird slides here. So this was just a sampling of some of the bird. There was a rather large and nice nature reserve in Buenos Aires close to the hotel, so I went there a couple of times, and there was quite a bit of interesting things. So these are some common birds: Huayra cuckoo, Nande parakeet on the top right, and these Coscaroba swans and Picasero pigeons, and those are all fairly common birds right in the downtown of a city of millions of people. So after we went down to Ushuaia again, I had a couple of days before the ship left, and fortunately just to the west of Ushuaia there's a national park in southern Patagonia, which is quite a nice place to go and hike around and explore the terrain. Again, just a sampling of some of the birds, the land birds.
Oh, nice.
These are Chimango caracaras on the top left, and then that is a upland goose on the top right, and these nocturnal or these diurnal owl, the austral pygmy owls, and southern lapwings. So just a few of the birds that you saw along the national park trails, and we were able to do a bit of botanizing, but I didn't bring any slides on the plans that would make the talk far too long. Just a comment, looks a lot like Canada. They've introduced beavers down there, but it's not turned out well for the ecosystems down there, and there's damming and flooding and killing off of trees to an ecosystem that's not really adapted to them. They're a bit of a pest. I think it was for trapping and for fur to diversify the economy. I don't know why anybody else would introduce beavers, but and another big problem, these European rabbits are quite common in the national park too. So they have their problems with invasives down there, but regardless, it's a beautiful place in southern Patagonia. You'll see, condors and alpacas in the highlands, and a lot of these forests is there's a genus of southern beech called Nothofagus, and they're quite common. There's several species, and there's a lot of intact forest in this park, which was quite nice, and it supports critters like these Magellanic woodpeckers. They're like the size of our pileated, so they're quite nice to see. And for lunch, you get these Patagonian Sierra finches would join you and come down and quite friendly. Not a huge variety of birds down there, but all of them were quite interesting. And along the shores, just before we left, along the harbors, these are dolphin gulls, which are quite common along the waterfront and throughout a lot of places in southern South America. So, okay, so this is how we traveled. We were 18 days at sea, going, and I'll show you the route. This is the ship that we were on. There's some demand. It was called it's a Russian ship, Academic Sergei Vavilov, and there's a sister ship that looks very much like it called the Academic Iofe, and they were a pair of research ships where they would do sonar soundings and doing mapping of ocean floors, where one was ascending and this ship would receive the signal, so they would work in tandem, and they sort of in the off season when like in the Russian winter, they would come down and take tourists. So back in the day when you would actually sail with Russian crews and stuff, I don't know how that is now, but this Canadian company would charter this boat every year and take some spaces on it. And so it was quite a sturdy ship, built in Finland in 1999. Not really fancy. This is not 5 stars, very much like a 3-star hotel. Comfortable and clean, but not really flashy at all. But you can see 6 meters draft and 9 meters from waterline to the tip, and I'll show you what a 9-meter wave looks like later in the presentation. It's 100 meters long, about 300 feet, and fortunately they would let us go up in the bridge up there whenever we wanted, and it was quite empty. You could talk to the crew, but a lot of them didn't speak English. But it was a nice place to watch. It's nice high viewpoint and heated, and so it was kind of nice in the worst of the weather. And the door was always open. You could, unless it was very tense, like when we were going through icebergs at night kind of thing. They didn't want me in there. But anyway, so you had to be prepared for seasickness. So all throughout the ship there are these barf bags scattered all around, and they kept every coffee table in the hallways had them just in case. But we mostly had decent weather. Anyway, so here's the route that we took when we left Ushuaia. We sailed for 1 or 2 nights to get to the Falkland Islands. That was an amazing trip. It was warm, and wind on your back, and the waves were small, and it was just beautiful water and lots of whales, lots of seabirds and stuff, very calm. Then the next leg, so we were in Falklands for a few days, and I'll talk about that. And then we went off to South Georgia. That was about 3 days to get there. The only way to get there is by ship. It's too far for any helicopters, and there's nowhere that you can land a plane on that island. So you go by ship, or you don't go. Then we headed south down to the South Orkney Islands, and I've got shots from all these locations, over to the South Shetlands, and then down right onto the peninsula itself for continental landing. So this, and then back over the Drake Passage, which you probably know can be one of the roughest patches of ocean in the world, with the prevailing winds and currents are pretty nasty. If it's nice and calm, it's called the Drake Lake, but if it's rough, it's called the Drake Quake or the Drake Shake, whatever. So we headed back across around Cape Horn and back to Ushuaia, and again, so that took 18 days to do that. So when I speak about Antarctica, this is what I mean. It's the area within the blue circle, which is known as the Antarctic Convergence, or also called the South Polar Front. Inside that area, the water, temperature, chemistry, biology, all the flora and fauna is very different than on the outside of it. So that's generally what people mean when they refer to the Antarctic, because it's just all the communities and abiotic things are very similar within that area. It's the largest kind of ecological boundary in the world. So within that boundary, it's pretty rich. 70 million birds nesting within there, but only about 40 species. So there's an awful lot of a few things. And the continent itself, just some statistics, it's amazing. The ice in there can get up, it's up to 4 kilometers thick. World's coldest temperatures, minus 89. There's a Russian research station. That's the coldest temperature ever on planet Earth. And windy, it's very windy, up to 300 kilometers an hour.
Ooh.
They call them these katabatic winds. They're basically coming off of ice shelves, and there's these cold air masses are coming so fast the gravity is pulling them down, and sustained. They've had winds there of over 100 kilometers an hour for 10 days straight.
Wow.
It's just unbelievable. We had decent weather when we were there. It was very pleasant. We had a taste of some storms, but really nothing to worry about. So you can't really talk about Antarctica without talking about krill. This is basically the whole keystone for the entire ecosystem down there, and it links these very, very short food chains where these guys will feed on diatoms and blue whales will feed on them, and that goes right from, that's the whole food chain right there. So it's very simple. Unbelievable numbers of these to support that many birds and mammals. They estimate 600 million tons of these things, more, and that's by biomass. There's no other animal on Earth that weighs more than these things. They can get into these incredibly dense swarms, like near Elephant Island, which I'll show you. In 1981, they found a swarm that was 150 square kilometers, and it was 200 meters deep.
Wow.
They estimated 10 kilograms per cubic meter of these things, and they estimate somewhere between 2 and 9 billion of these. And the swarm was so big there were 40 Russian trawlers fishing that swarm of these krill. So it's a bit of a problem. They do harvest these for, I'm not sure what, for food or for the protein.
Fertilizer, maybe?
Yeah, it's kind of a waste because the entire ecosystem depends on these things. And, but when they get into swarms that big, it's easy for a thing like a blue whale to feed on them. But they do that because they have what's called mass sensation of prey. Like they need to find the diatoms and things, and when a few of them find them, they all need to find them, and then they kind of travel around looking for what they need to feed on. So it's sort of why they tend to get into these concentrations. Just a bit of chemistry. They have in their exoskeleton, like they're like a shrimp, they have a chemical called fluorine, which is toxic when it's concentrated. So that's why when penguins eat them, they don't stay in their bodies for very long. So they go in, and 3 hours later they're passed out. And that's why there's pink feces everywhere in the Antarctic, because these guys they're going through the penguins as quick as possible. Some penguins have an ability to, like, they can sequester the fluorine in their bones, so it's not as toxic, and their liver breaks it down over time. So some penguins have that ability, but there are some species of squid that eat a lot of that, and since they don't have any bones, scientists don't really know how they deal with this toxic fluorine in their bodies. So it's an area of research that they were working on. Okay, so the Falkland Islands. This is where we stopped on our first area. This is a big archipelago. It's almost 800 islands. You're 500 kilometers offshore from Argentina here. Pretty nice area. Elevation is 700 meters, so not quite as high as Mount Carlton in New Brunswick. The Brits came there in 1760s, and they claimed there were no occupants there, but the Argentinians dispute that. Currently, there's about 2,500 residents, or again in 2008. Plus, there's a British military there. This is sort of an enclave, or it's a British territory. And almost all the people, about 2,000 of them, live in Stanley, which is I'll show you that in a minute. It's on the far east end there. Interesting place. About 170 native species of plants there, and 13 which are endemic. Well, I'm talking about plants. When in Antarctica, I was able to see every single species of plant in Antarctica when I was there, both of them. So, there's only two. There's a grass and there's a little pearlwort. So they were both grown on the same rock. So not many continents you can say you've seen every species. But. So here's where we stopped. We had a morning on on Carcass Island, a number of these islands have rats on them, so that's not good for the native birds. But this one, the conservationists have focused on and kept it quite free of rats. And then we stopped at Saunders Island, and then an overnight trip over to Stanley, and we just spent a day there and then onward. So it was about 2 days in the Falklands. Pretty neat spot. Just showing you how do you get on and off of that research ship to get onto shore. Well, you've seen that in the Arctic talk about these zodiacs. They have a crane. There's about 8 or 10 of those, and I've got other shots. So you just take a gangway down the stairs, and you put 6 or 8 people, and you boat into shore when it's calm enough. And if it's too rough, you just can't go out. So you have a pretty flexible schedule. If you can land, you land, and if you can't, you just go on to the next spot. And you don't really have a choice where you land. They propose about 15 spots, and you'll only get to about 10 of them, and it depends on the weather which 10 you get to. So, once you're on shore, you start seeing tame birds like these Magellanic penguins. We were lucky in January. A lot of birds were nesting. We saw a lot of young birds and nests and eggs and things. So this penguin is kind of the least of the Antarctic species that we saw, and they're normally north of the convergence that I was talking about, but sometimes they get as far as South Georgia, which is within true Antarctica. So they nest in ground burrows, and you can see they had some young. They start nesting in September, and then the young will disperse about in March and April, so about now. This is an endemic bird, the Falkland flightless steamer duck.
Right.
You can see how short its wings are, and when there's no predators, you don't really need to fly. So they lost the ability to fly a long time ago. So there still are no real land. There's no mammalian predators. So they're excellent swimmers, but they just wander around on shore. You can see they had young there January, but the impact of man. Sorry,
Would that be a male or a female, or are they similar?
I can't remember. I think that's a male. It looks fairly brightly colored. I think
Yeah.
the females tend to be drabber, more mottle brown sort of thing. But you can see problems with waste, fishing nets and plastics and things. Jets them along the beaches, and some of them are cleaned up. Like the tourists would land on these. The beaches are spectacular. They're beautiful white sand and clear water, but of course the water's just above freezing. You do see a bit of jetsam that's drifted onto shore, but didn't see a ton of it. These little guys, and you're lucky when you're down there. The birds are all quite tame. You can walk very close, and they're generally not afraid of people. So things like this is a blackish Synclodes. It's an endemic species, but this is one of the things. If there were rats on this island, these wouldn't stand a chance. The rats feed them, and they depredate the nests. And so that's why we went there. And then that's another endemic, the Cobb's wren. They're very similar to house wrens, but it's endemic to the Falkland Islands.
Oh.
So here we have Magellanic oyster catchers, which kind of look like our Americans that we have down on Grand Manan. We did see some of them with nests and eggs there, and we did see some juveniles the next day. So it's nice to have shorebirds that are tame. I didn't have a fancy camera on this trip. I had a $300 Nikon point and shoot, so it's pretty easy to get photos. There's a very few photos that I borrowed from people on the trip that I just couldn't get photos of myself. I'll try to give credit where credit is due. So you see a lot of seabird species. It's nice to get close. They're on the ship. You're seeing them all around the ship all the time, but it's really nice to see them on the ground nesting. So these are black-browed albatrosses. This is over on Saunders Island. So about 80% of this species nests in the Falklands. And there was an island not far from here. There was 100,000 pairs on that island, probably a steeple-adjacent island. But it's a pretty sensitive site, so the tourist ships aren't allowed to land there. This is a much smaller colony, so the tourists can get their pictures and things. But so they feed mostly on crustaceans, including the krill, but they also eat things like squid and fish. They were having a good time. They're actually quite a big bird. Their wingspan is about like this, about 2 meters. And they do breed every year, but the females only lay 1 egg, as you can see. So she's only got one chick there, but they build up these little mud bowls. Now, penguin species number 2. This is a rockhopper penguin, also on Saunders Islands, and these ones are mostly found north of the convergence. So again, this isn't one of the true Antarctic species. But yeah, rockhoppers are named because they are very agile and they can hop from rock to rock. And it's surprising how easily they move on land. They do kind of hop. Neat fact, they're one of the few penguins that go into the water feet first. Most of them dive in head first, but not these guys. So it's odd to see them when they do rest. They'll just lie on their bellies and stuff, but they're not a very big. There's 18 species of penguins, and this is the 3rd smallest, so they're only about this tall. Again, they tend to eat the smaller crustaceans, copepods, amphipods, isopods. They have very high nest site fidelity, so they're back year after year. And these ones tend to lay 2 eggs at a time, but rarely do both of them hatch, and both of their parents will incubate their nests. So here we are into, these are imperial or blue-eyed cormorants, or the British call them shags. This is some of there's about 10,000 breeding pairs of these in the southern hemisphere, so this is just a fairly small colony. And with this one, you can see that they're mixed in with, there's a few rockhopper penguins mixed in, and the black-browed albatross were nesting very close to that. So this Saunders is a very popular place with the tourists because you can just walk along established trails and get quite close to these huge colonies of birds. So, this is a blubber pot. This is when the Brits and the Americans and the Russians came here in the early 1800s. They were after oil from the whales, the seals, and penguins. So this is an actual historical artifact where they would, in this case, they would hunt southern elephant seals and penguins, and they would just use their fat, render the oil in these big pots, send the oil back to the United Kingdom, and they used it back in that day mostly for lubrication. But they need to render it, so you can see they did have to burn not a lot of trees, well, no trees down on the Falklands, so they burned peat. There's thick peat deposits throughout there, so they would use that to burn and melt down the oil from the thousands of animals that they killed for their oil, and then send the oil back to the homeland. But that doesn't happen anymore. And again, this is another endemic bird. This is called the striated caracara on Saunders Island. It's a scavenging type predator, and they tend to not be. There's a lot of sheep on the Falkland Islands, and the sheep ranchers don't really like them because they're quite aggressive with the sheep. They can, even when they're alive, they can get in and sort of pick at their backs and try to get the fat into tissue in their backs. So they're not well liked down by the locals, but nice to see a predator that you can walk right up to. So here I am. We did land in Stanley, which was looks like any other British town. There's pubs and libraries and churches and things. And like I say, most of the people that live there are either working in fishing or supporting the military or ranching sheep. And there's a bit of tourism. There's tourists that come there, and quite a nice place to live because a lot of people want to move there, and they have real high restrictions on immigration there. But, so we had spent a day walking around town, and we were just this is an example of how they were mining peat. There's this historic trough near the harbor. The airport is not far from there. You can actually fly here, but see an old shipwreck in the harbor. But we just wandered around and did manage to see a few of the native species of plants there, a few things in flower. The fellow in the red coat, that was our guide. I was with a group of about 10 or so British people, and he was the guide. That was about his 20th trip to the Antarctic, so he was good at identifying and spotting wildlife, and a lot of the people on the trip were quite good with, especially with whales. They could spot them a long way and just by the shape of the blow and the diving frequency, they could identify stuff. So it was a good group. On the Falklands, we did see, these are kelp geese. That's a male on the top left and the female. These are just wandering around the waterfront in town. The local name for the residents of the Falklands, they call themselves kelpers, named after these geese. So just a local nickname. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the Falkland Island War. Was it 1989 or 83? I think 83. Yeah. Okay. So the Argentines, they claim that it's called the Malvinas and it's their land, and the Brits disagree with that. So the Argentines had an incursion in there, and the Brits very quickly sent warships and killed thousands of Argentinian troops and only 25 British. But this is a remnant from that war. There are suspect area, in other words, there are probably landmines throughout there, and they come and go with the tides. And so good for the birds, because the sheep, they keep the sheep, and the sheep are out, and the tussock grasses are native, and they get nice and tall and dense, and the native birds can burrow and stuff, but they don't let sheep in there or people, so at least the birds can use it. And I think they're too small to set off the landmines, but we were told not to go within there, so bit of history. And this is another species of cormorant called the rock shag, and they were nesting just outside of Stanley on some of the cliffs there. So quite nice looking birds. Maybe half hour into that? Okay, that's good. Okay, so when you send 30,000 people to the Antarctic, this was then, I think it's gone up. You know, there's going to be some impact, so they try to minimize that on places like, so we're heading to South Georgia now. So in preparation for that, they said, we want you to vacuum your shoes, your pants, your backpacks and everything, get all the seeds and the soil and the guano off your clothing, because we don't want any weeds or plants or anything spreading in there. So that was kind of reassuring. Boot washing stations, there's disinfectant. Every time you got on and off the ship for a shore landing, you were to clean your boots, and there are scrubbers and hoses, so don't bring any mud on or off. And plus your boots, I mean, you have to keep them on the ship, and they're covered in guano, and your room smells like guano by the end of the trip. I can't remember. So, but this is just before we went to South Georgia, getting ready to disembark. But they say 3 days at sea to get there. About halfway between the Falklands and there, this is kind of a famous landmark called the Shag Rocks. They are just in the middle of nowhere. They're 300 kilometers away from South Georgia, and these are just oceanic mountaintops sticking out in the middle of nowhere. If I recall, we saw a turkey vulture around there. It was crazy. It was an awful long way from land. But, anyway, and then we did start to see our first icebergs. This one, this is when they're flat top, they're called tabular icebergs, and that one was probably grounded because it's on such a weird angle. So we did see lots of icebergs, and that was one of our first.
And what is a bird on the left-hand side? Is that a school or something?
That's, yeah, probably a giant petrel. I'll show you pictures of. I mean, yeah, that was like, and I'm not sure if southern or northern. We'll talk about those shortly. So South Georgia, this was we were 2-3 days there. It was pretty spectacular. Again, here's some of our landings. Rosita Harbor, seals. Salisbury Plain, internationally famous for its penguins. Pine Island we tried to land on, and unfortunately we didn't. That's the only chance we had to see the only passerine in the Antarctic. They have a pipit species, and can't see them from the ship. I tried, but it was too rough. It just, if the tides and the swells are too bad, you're getting out and your Zodiac goes under and a wave comes up and it gets underneath the gangplank, it'll flip and tear the boat into nothing. And they make those decisions on the spot. So yeah, and it was a wandering albatross colony that we could have got to, but anyway, most of our landings were able to do that one. We couldn't, so we moved on to the next place. So there's these Norwegian whaling stations. So a lot of these names are, Scandinavian. So Lusik was the one station, and then Grytviken and There's a Stromness is also there, which we did not stop at. But the Norwegians were there the longest. And then further down to Gold Harbor and Dragalski Fjord. So those are our various landing points. It's kind of, you'd spend 2-3 hours and then you'd go on the boat, have lunch, and they would move, and then you'd spend an afternoon, and then overnight you'd move. So yeah, South Georgia, pretty amazing. 30 million birds nesting on these islands, about 27 species. So, and half of the world's macaroni penguins, or 2 million pairs. But they were, at the time, their numbers were going down. And about half of the world's gray-headed albatross, of which we saw a lot, about 80,000 pairs nesting in South Georgia. So incredible amounts of wildlife, because all this krill and these upwellings from the deep water supporting all this diversity. So we did have beautiful weather a lot of the time. So just anchored, and you can see that. So there's us getting on and off, down the gangway onto a Zodiac. So we're just waiting for other passengers to get off, anchored offshore for a landing.
So when you would do one of these landings on those little boats, how many people were going at once in a bunch of
Well, you'd get about 8 or 10. So you'd have there's about 100 of us trying to get off and on every time.
Okay.
So there's they'd have, I don't know, they probably had 8 boats, and not everybody get off. So you'd fill up one boat, and it would go in and drop off, and the guides would drive the boats, and then when they got everybody on, they'd come on shore for a little bit. But it didn't take that long, and they would tell you what, they would say, you'd be assigned a boat number and say, hey, everybody on boat 7, get going. It was really well organized how you could get that many people on and off that quickly. So when you're down there, you start to see Antarctic fur seals by the lots. So this is at Rosita Harbor. Again, these are a krill feeder. This is a male. It's a relatively small one. The big ones can get up to be heavier than me, 200 kilos. And he doesn't look fast, but he can run faster than me. Yeah, they're surprisingly fast on land. So you don't really get too close to them. They can be quite aggressive. You know when you're too close. So these are pups. They're born on land, and about 10% of them are like this. They're blonde. They call them blonde. They're not really albinos. They're just sort of this pale color. And so there was a few of those. We weren't supposed to get too close to them. We'd stay on trails, but the females, they give birth, and very soon after they give birth, they mate very soon after they've had it. So it's kind of this ongoing meal of seal pups. And this one was sleeping, so you got a good shot of the fur and just how dense it is. They have a lot of these guard hairs and under fur, and so they were hunted for this fur really, really intensively right up to around 1900. It was mostly Americans and British, but Russians, Indians came down, and most of the fur went to China. They were sold there. So they were, yeah. So at one point there was only 300 of these left down around South Georgia, and they were just on the most remotest of the islands. But when they stopped hunting, they rebounded, and now they figured there was about 1 million of them. And so it took 100 years to recover their historic numbers, so they're not hunted. But they also had a lot less conflict with the whales. There was fewer whales, so there was more krill, and there was lots of food for them. So.
Is that fellow asleep?
Yeah, they just lying there in the gale force wind didn't seem to bother them. So this is a larger male there, and they're a harem species. So one male would kind of guard or protect about 30 females. So those are the ones you want to stay away from, the big males and stuff. But it takes a bit of energy to defend all the females. So I spoke about these giant petrels. These are quite large seabird. Nice to see one up close. We see them at sea all the time.
Did you say petrel?
That's a giant petrel.
Petrel.
So it's similar. Yes.
That's a petrel?
Yes. That's northern giant petrel. So there's a northern and a southern, and they're pretty easy to tell at this distance because, like a stoplight, the northern one's the red on the nail of the bill, like a stoplight. The red's on the top, and then the southern, the green is like a stop on the bottom. So I'll show you a southern giant in a minute. But There was about 3,000 pairs of these on South Georgia nesting. They nest a bit earlier than the southern giant petrels, and they're primarily scavengers. Again, a lot of them do feed on krill or fish or squid or things like that. So you often see them far out at sea, but it's nice to get close to one. See the tubes on their nose to excrete the salt from all the food and water that they ingest. So this is Stromness whaling station, or what's left of it. There is people living there, but it's not of course being used for whaling anymore. And you're likely familiar with the story of Ernest Shackleton and the big failure of that mission, but he did manage to rescue his entire crew. Nobody died on that. So when he landed on the opposite side of South Georgia, he had to climb over those mountains that nobody had ever done, and come down, and then you could see the station, but he had to scale this big waterfall, which is that one. Man, they just kind of swam down. It was the quickest and easiest way, and they're getting soaked, but they were so close to being rescued, they didn't care. But anyway, that's a whole other story. It's amazing story in survival and willpower. So these whaling stations, it's pretty sad. They operated for about 60 years in 1904, but 175,000 whales slaughtered in these whaling stations over those years, and processed in these whaling stations. These guys that come down and work, and it's pretty scary. There's museums at Grytviken, and they show just the harbors, which is it's like a giant bloodbath. There's so much blood and guts, and they stunk because they're rendering all this whale, and they're gutting these whales. And miserable existence, but they made a lot of money. So, anyway, this is where the manager lived. That was a modern house. There was still a Norwegian presence there, just sort of maintaining the buildings and trying to keep tourists out. It has a lot of rusty nails and asbestos and things like that. So. And there's the man's grave, Shackleton's grave, which is kind of this is in Grytviken now, in the next harbor over. So there's a British presence there now, and there's a nice museum, and there's churches, and they actually have a post office. So they're glad to see the tourist ships because they don't get a lot of visitors down there. And we actually had the residents out to our ship for a supper one night. It was nice and calm. They could get back and forth. So tradition to go, and everybody has a shot of rum, and you drink half and throw the other half on his grave. So that's there's an awful lot of rum spilled on Korol's, but that's where he's buried. But we tramped around Grytviken for a day, and it was fabulous to see these. These are light-mantled sooty albatross. There is actually a dark-mantled, which we did not see, but so they're pretty neat. They nest on these cliffs, and they can nest. If their nest fails, they can nest in the following year. But if they do have a chick, then they have to wait 2 years before they can nest again. They mainly squid, fish, and occasionally they'll scavenge carrion like dead penguins and things like that. But they're just amazingly beautiful birds, huge, and these very elaborate courtship flights that they can do, these mirror flights, and they'll green each other mutually and stuff. And it was nice to just sit there and watch them on the cliffs. And Antarctic terns. So they do not migrate up here in our summer, but our terns are down there in the winter. So we did see both, but fortunately they are in breeding plumage in January, and ours are not. So easy to tell apart. These guys just kind of plunge dive like they do, like our terns plunge for fish, krill, and surface fish, and there's about 10,000 pairs of them nesting on South Georgia. And sort of an endemic, so this is the South Georgia shag. Those orange deals at the base of the bill are called caruncles, so they just function to excrete salt from their diet and stuff. They're amazing divers. They can dive up to 90 meters down, and they'll eat things like fish and octopus on the ocean bottom. And I showed you earlier, Antarctic shags. Coming up maybe. There's another species called the Antarctic shag. They're similar, but they're a little bit smaller. They nest further south than them. About 7,500 pairs of them nesting in South Georgia. And then you see kelp gulls, different from the dolphin gulls, so they're very similar to our black-backed gulls. So that's the most common gull you'll see in the Antarctic, and they primarily eat fish, but again they'll eat other things like these limpets, so they'll just ingest them whole and they'll digest the soft bits and then they regurgitate the shells. What other tidbits? Oh yeah, the good thing about them is they will actually eat rats, so they help keep the non-native rats under control. They're predatory and they can, when they catch the rats, they can get them. So there's about 2,000 nesting pairs of those on South Georgia. So again, the Falkland Island War, the Argentines decided to come in and the British quickly shot it down, and that's been there for a long time. It's full of bullet holes, but I think they just were using it for target practice a lot. The Argentines did come to South Georgia just for a few days in 1982, but the Brits, I think they didn't stay for very long. I think the Brits had a good military presence and kicked them out pretty quick. So, off to, I forget, it was the next stop, I forget what this stop on the itinerary, Salisbury Plain, yeah. So these are king penguins, which of course, these are the second largest penguins. We had a shot to hopefully see an emperor penguin. There was one, but we had been seen, but we didn't see it, so. We didn't see that one. It wasn't expected because they nest a lot farther south than we got, but anyway, these guys are pretty amazing. They primarily eat fish. They're called lanternfish. They can dive down to about 50 meters, or that's typically where they go, but they can go as deep as 300 meters to feed on the fish. Pretty amazing. So this is just some courtship behavior where the male is breeding a female. About 400,000 pairs of these guys on South Georgia, and at the time their numbers were actually increasing. So, Salisbury Plain is kind of the place to go and see them. They have a pretty long. The young take quite a long time to mature. And their plumage isn't waterproof, so they molt on land. They don't really go out to. They're on land for about a year and a half. And their parents have to bring them food, but they're in different stages of molt there. So that one on the upper right, that's about a 2-year-old up there. And then when they get to be about 4, then they're able to mate and reproduce and head out to sea themselves. And there was lots.
Wow.
So that's just some, about 60,000 pairs at this colony where we were at. And you can climb up on those cliffs and get a good view up there. So they're in, again, they're all in different stages of their breeding cycles. And these guys, yeah, they were hunted like crazy for their oil. But once that stopped, they started to grow and increase, and they grew at about pretty quick, 5 to 15% per year. And now there were colonies that were long extinct that are being repopulated. So their numbers have really rebounded since they stopped being hunting. But yeah, if you had a wide-angle lens, you get more of it. And noisy, very, very vocal.
It must have been smelly.
Yeah, everywhere's smelly, like everywhere, and I'll show you some close-ups. Like it's just the guano. You say you're covered in it, and you want to get photo. You lie on the ground to take a picture, so it's just completely yeah, it's everywhere. So they have to scratch, but it was surreal to watch them get up. That one there's trying to get up, so when they lie on their belly, they push with their bill and their beaks, and they just kind of magically pop up. You can't describe it till you see it. It looks so. It's just like they defy gravity when they get up. It's really bizarre. But anyway, so these are fairly big, about 13 kilos, and like I say, these are the second biggest penguins. They're not quite as high as this, but I don't know. They're nice to get, and then you can get pretty close to them. They're pretty tolerant.
Were they inquisitive?
So. There are photos. That guy that I was showing there. He's got I think a giant petrel where he's lying on the ground and he's coming in and he's pecking at the tip of his camera lens.
Oh.
The giant petrel. So we got a photo of him while that's happening. they're not shy, but they don't really kind of come up to you. But pretty amazing. So I haven't talked about southern elephant seals. That's a small male. And I never used to like take pictures with people in there, but somebody said take pictures because you'll get a sense of scale and how big it is. That's a small guy. The big guy, that's the largest seal there is in the world. But the big guys are from here to the piano, 5 meters and 4,000 kilograms. So he wouldn't have any females. He's too small. And again, they're also a harem species, so one male will have about 100 females. And the big guys, they're called beach masters. And so they'll manage to do one breeding season, and then they're pretty much done because they get so injured, so many infections, and they lose weight and they're stressed, and they mate with 100 females, and then the next year they're so beat up they can't do it. So this guy will get his. But and they're way bigger than the females, and they're just enormous. Yeah, you don't want to get too close to them, but so these are females. So there's about 400,000 of these southern elephant seals on South Georgia. And again, when they were hunted, they were almost to the point of extinction, but they've rebounded. There's plenty of them there now, and you can see they're quite big eyes, and they need them in the depths to see squids and stuff, but unbelievable diver. They can go under 3 hours underwater, up to 1,800 meters below the surface, and they can come up 2 minutes, they go back down for another 3 hours. Unbelievable diving adaptations, yeah. So, but the thing is, if they had known that one male will breed with 100 females, they could have killed 80% of the males and had no impact on the populations. They didn't know that in the 1800s, so they killed females and whatever they could. So they could have sustainably harvested the males because only 1% of them were breeding, but they didn't know that till well after the sealing had stopped. Anyway, just a close up. So, one of my favorite birds, this is a snowy sheathbill at Gold Harbor. These are actually migratory. They're kind of like chickens. They wander around, very strong flyers, so they will fly across the ocean. They will come down to southern Argentina in the winter. And there's not much food, so they pretty much eat everything. They'll eat guano and feces. They'll eat AA batteries. They will eat wounds on other pecking way. They'll eat nasal mucus out of seals' noses and things, but whatever they can eat. And it's kind of neat. There's only 2 species of sheathbills in the world, and this is the only family of birds that's found only in the Antarctic, or subantarctic and Antarctic regions. Delighted to see this one. There was a few, they were fairly common down there. So we sailed on, and I don't know, another grounded iceberg, kind of a neat shape on that guy. This is now to the east end of South Georgia. You're into Berdelsky. I'm about 2/3 of the way here. I can go a little faster if we're running. See, it's after 8. Are we all good? Okay, all right. I'll go a little faster. Anyway, so amazing birds at sea. Snow petrel, just a spectacular seabird out there. And then these are Antarctic prions. So they're on the left there. 22 million pairs of them nesting on South Georgia. A ground nesting thing, and but the fur seals tend to erode their habitat, so they don't do well when the fur seals kind of increase. And again, they're mostly eating krill and crustaceans, but they can also filter feed. So after leaving South Georgia, we went across to the South Orkneys. This is Orcata Station, the oldest research station in the Antarctic. And the ship captain radios ahead, how's the ice on shore? And they don't see a lot of tourist ships. It's fine, come in, no problem, we'll have lunch. And you get there and it's full of icebergs. Captain wasn't happy because it's just, the wind could shift and we'd be all stuck on the island, and you shouldn't have told us to come, it's too much ice, but we got in and out. So there it is. You're at about 60 degrees south latitude there. This was established by the Scots in 1904, and it's the oldest climate. It's an old station. They do climate research down there, and it's currently Argentinians doing that. And just some grounded icebergs near there. You can't really see them, but there are hundreds of penguins on the face of that iceberg. So more icebergs. This is a huge tabular iceberg that we went around. There was many faces, but we went around one side. It was 10 kilometers of the wall
Wow.
ice on the one side. We couldn't see the other side. But the good thing is, if there's the storm, this was getting pretty stormy, and you can actually get in behind them and take some shelter from the wind. But you also don't want to get close because
Yeah.
it's calve and there's tidal waves and things like that. So it was getting windy. This was the one big storm we got into. So the Beaufort's, this was 9 to 10 on the Beaufort scale, which is a strong gale storm. Yes, so we sailed into that. It was a lot of fun, but it was rough, like really rough. So anyway, so the bow is just off the surface of the water there, and those, we're up on the bridge, and it's just one of the shots. I've got some movies of this. It's amazing. Of course, they don't let you out there, and it was windy. Hang on. So,
It's windy.
yeah, I'm gonna hang on. So, we got to the actual Antarctic Peninsula. Some stops. We stopped at a place, King George Island. These are all quite famous tourist stops. Livingston, Deception Island, which was a fabulous place. There's an old caldera. You actually sail into a thing called through the Neptune's bellows. There's the wind tunnels through this thing, and we could have gone to the hot springs there, but it was too rough. But yeah, there's all this volcanic activity. It's really geologically interesting. We went to Danko Island and got as far south as the Sneeko Harbor, and all this area, all that was, they were sealing in there 1820 to 1840. They were hunting seals for 40 years. They're 20 years through there. So we were on King George Island now, on the peninsula, and we ran into, these are Adélie penguins. There was some French explorer's wife, his name was Adélie, and that's what he named them after his wife. So this is one of the true Antarctic species. They'll never be found north of the convergence. And this is one that's in trouble with climate. There's only about 200 pairs here. Used to be 1,000 when, that was 10 years before we went. But it's, low breeding success. There was only one chick in this colony that we could see. But I said, just like wearing a wetsuit in July, they're very intolerant of warmth. If it's above zero, it's incredibly uncomfortable because they're so well insulated. But they're very, very agile. They just can whip up and down those. That's quite a steep rock face, but you can see the piles of guano and stuff. And unfortunately, they've done research on them. They're finding organic pollutants in them and PCBs and stuff, so it's creeping down into those ecosystems. But this is King George Island. We got on this. There's an old lava cone there. That's some fabulous lichens on there.
Yeah,
You can see.
nice looking lichen.
Yeah, and we got an elephant seal in the corner there. So you go out and tramp around, and you get a couple hours on there. But you can see all the kind of lava piles in the background. Quite spectacular. The aptly named chinstrap penguin, which is on King George Island. So they're a specialist feeder on krill. They don't seldom dive deeper than 40 meters because that's mostly what they eat. But they're very inquisitive, and here you see the photograph. And they had decent nesting success, but they just kind of pile up rocks, and that's their little nest platform. But you see the pink, like the young and them, just full of guano.
Pretty big feet on the youngster.
Yeah. They like to nest on these rocky cliffs, but they're very, very good climbers, and at the time their numbers were increasing. But maybe because it's getting warmer further south, and they can actually expand into that, whereas a lot of other species just can't handle that. And again, the lack of whale harvesting, there was more krill, so their numbers increased. Here's a South Polar skua. Nice to see one close up. There's 3 species down there, but gold nape makes this a south polar, and they're kind of scavengers and predators. So I'm not sure what species that's from, but just a close-up of a penguin wing, but you can see why they're waterproof. The feathers are so dense, and the barbs are very, very interlocked. And then underneath there's some very small downy feathers that also act as insulation. And it might be the last. These are Gentoo penguins, which we saw kind of everywhere, and they had pretty good nest success. But, this is on Danko Island. There's 100,000 pairs of these guys on South Georgia, so we saw them there. And so they must have had a pretty good year for food, because this adult had 2 chicks. And they tend to like nest higher up on the slopes, so they're going up and down these slopes, and they go so often they wear these trails through the snow drifts. They're good divers. They go down to about 100 meters to catch their food, but they go up these slopes to kind of they like areas that elephant seals frequent, so they tend to be higher up to avoid the elephant seals in their nest colonies. Yeah, just a close up of a foot to see how you can see how they can swim and climb rocks with those strong toes and feet. So we were able to hike at one point when the boats dropped us off. We got to walk about this trail for about 1 kilometer. It's kind of a standard tourist thing. This is called Hannah Point, and again, very, very volcanic landscape, and there was some neat minerals in the soil. There were olivine and a few other things, and there were some elephant seals there on the left. They were molting, and so you get all these tourists in there, and you think, well, how does that affect the wildlife? It goes right through a penguin colony. So again, I thought, well, get people in the picture. It gives you an idea of how big that is. So what they did before they built this trail is they put some fake eggs in with these heart monitors, and they would send tourists through and see how their heart rate went when people walked through, and they discovered that there was a certain point where they didn't seem to be bothered. Their heart rate didn't change, or if a predator flew over, they'd monitor and compare that. So the trail was designed with that in mind, and we didn't want to impact the animals too much. So they did that experiment so they don't really want the tourists to be causing them a lot of stress. So they sort of demonstrated that and they measured stress hormones in some of them, and it didn't really seem to have much of an effect. So they allowed the tourists to walk through their colonies. Time for another penguin species. I haven't mentioned macaroni penguins. This guy, this was at Hannah Point. That's actually the most common penguin in the world. There's about 12 million pairs globally, and South Georgia had about 1 million of those, but their numbers were decreasing at the time. And the most common, but this was the only one we saw on land. We saw a few out at sea, but it was good to get a picture when we could.
It's not very beefy, it's kind of skinny.
Yeah. Yeah, they're funny looking. They have a big heavy bill on them. Beautiful. So anyway, these are southern giant petrels. You see they kind of have that greenish gray tip on the bill, unlike the northern giants. They're a lot more sensitive to disturbance, so that's why the digiscope photo, you're not allowed within 50 meters of the nest, so I took that. Anyway, they hatch their chicks, and they take about 6-7 years to mature. They just fly around. They don't come to land for 6 or 7 years, and then they'll breed. But they're a very key scavenger in Antarctic ecosystems, but they do also eat squid and krill and fish. So now this is an elephant seal. They just kind of groan. They're kind of loud, but they're not really that threatening. But they do eat a lot of squid, and so those little peg-like teeth in the top, they help them to hang on to the squid, which they capture in the deep water and stuff. So getting down to the essence of the trip, right down near the southernmost point. And I didn't mention, I couldn't, anyway, that's an Antarctic minke whale. They did pretty well during whaling because they were one of the smallest whales. They wasn't as efficient to hunt them. They were small. And they were also one of the faster whales, so it was hard to get them, and the rewards weren't. So they weren't hunted too much, so they did better. And I didn't get really good pictures of whales. We saw lots, but it's just, you can't get pictures of them. But just so you know, we saw humpbacks, sei, fin, sperm, orca, southern right, southern bottlenose, and Cuvier's beak whales. We didn't see blue whales, which are still kind of recovering, but it was amazing. You'd see 10 or 25 whales every day you were out there.
Wow.
It was amazing. And, you know, they're still not back to their historic numbers, but it was really cool. And lots of dolphins again. Just hard to get photos, so I don't really have any. We saw forest commersons, peels, dusky, and hourglass dolphins. So lots of good mammals, but we did manage to see Weddell seals. And I didn't take this picture. My pictures just they just didn't show the color. I had to borrow that from a co-worker. So this or a co-traveler. Anyway, these guys, they feed on fish primarily, and they mostly just get those off the bottom, so they can dive to 300-400 meters. So eating all those raw fish, they tend to be pretty heavily impacted by parasites. But they do stay there in the winter, so they need to chew holes in the ice and keep them maintained and open for breathing, and then they defend them because it attracts females and things. So pretty interesting critters. Here is the most abundant marine mammal on here. That's a crab-eating seal, which is a weird name because there's no crabs in the Antarctica. But apparently there is now. I saw this documentary a while ago about how there are some invasive crabs moving in, and that's not a good thing. So, but anyway, they have these crazy, I should have put in a photo of their teeth. They have these really crazy teeth. They're like sieves, and they just literally filter out the krill out of the water. And
Oh,
so they have these bizarre patterns on their teeth, but they also, like the Weddell seal, they have to maintain holes in the ice to breathe over the winter. But they don't really know how many there are in the world, but they were guessing 30 to 40 million, but maybe not, maybe only 8 or 10 million. But there's a lot of them. We didn't see all that many, but 5 more slides. So this was just an iceberg down there, and I thought, nice to have your own private
Swimming
pool.
pool.
Yeah, those are Gentoo penguins, so they got to flip around. Yeah, they're not worried about predators in there, at least. Oh, and I think I mentioned killer whale.
ah,
So there's the big beast, the leopard seal.
Yeah.
Incredibly terrifying animals. They can come into your zodiac and eat it. 50% of their diet is krill, but they do also eat fish, penguins, and other seals, especially crab-eating seal pups. And they're violent. They'll catch a penguin and they'll just shake it back and forth and just tear the skin right off it and then eat it. And they're huge, and they're big, and they're strong. One of them, they cut it open, 16 Adelie penguins in its stomach. Huge diet and voracious predators. Yeah, just nothing but teeth. And it's rare, but they can attack boats and people, but they can swim 6 meters per second. They can come up to 2 meters, ice that's 2 meters high, they can swim up and jump on top of it.
ooh.
Crazy predators, yeah. So here's an iceberg that it had rolled over, and when they melt, they give off gas, and the gases go, and they make these lines or rills in there, and so when they flip over, when they lose their center of gravity, you can see what they've been doing underwater, but that's probably rolled a bunch of times. Pretty neat. And just cruising along, this is like a continental glacier just calving off into the sea, but you can just see, and that's only a few hundred meters, and see some of the glaciers there are 3-4 kilometers. So at the end of the trip, you have to go for a swim.
Oh,
Oh, my goodness.
So there you go. There was 7 of us that went in and got our certificates. So.
Wow.
Yeah, I like the one with the glacier. Minus 1.8 was the water, but it's actually so cold you don't even feel it because you're numb very quickly. But it was beautiful. No wind, +2, and we had just hiked up a mountain and came down, and you're warm. So
how long did you stay in?
I actually went in a couple times because they tried to take some pictures and they didn't turn out, so you have to go back. So. I don't know, but there were people that swam to that iceberg. There were people.
Wow,
10 minutes. Yeah.
wow, that's a What's
What's
up?
the temperature of the water?
Minus 1.8. Yeah.
Man.
Salt water. So yeah, that's almost 65 degrees south latitude there. So. Anyway, that's at Almirante Brown Research Station on Paradise Garden.
Great.
All right, thank you for listening. I'll take questions. Good.
How big is a krill?
Oh, that species was pretty big. I think they're like that, like 2 centimeters, maybe 1.5.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a number of species, but that's the biggest one. And I think the other ones are quite a bit smaller. Yeah.
Burke, I noticed in your first photo of king penguins, one of them had a red mallard stripe as opposed to yellow, or it looked red.
Oh yeah.
Is that unusual, or is it
Uh,
a young one, or because all the others seem to be yellow
yeah,
and then
I
in the
don't.
photograph?
I don't know. Maybe it's just blood in
The
the
lighting?
waters or something, or
Yeah.
it could be maybe he's trying to cool off and putting blood in there. I don't really know. I didn't notice it. I'm not sure because you know how some of those things with skin around their mouth they can kind of change.
Yeah,
color
yeah.
the way that, so.
Yeah, and that follow-up group picture, there were a couple in that that had that.
Oh, I didn't notice. I was
that
looking
one,
for another one.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. had
Your
that one.
slide, you had the,
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
I can go back to that.
yeah, it was
Okay.
So you didn't bring pictures of the two plants?
Oh, right.
Didn't. They're on iNaturalist if you.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. Colobanthus is the one genus, and the other one is it's a Deschampsia, I believe, is the grass.
So I didn't keep track. How many species of penguins did you see?
I think 7.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd say there had been a single emperor penguin at one point. It had been seen on previous trips, and we just sailed past it. We had about a 15-minute opportunity to see it. It just wasn't there that day.
Hmm.
We didn't see it, but yeah, there's a couple of birds that are they're too far south that we just didn't get. There's Antarctic petrel was one I wanted. We might get lucky, but they're down 70, 80 degrees latitude. They're another 500 kilometers south of where we were.
What's your view on what the Canadian expedition did to Antarctica this year? Have you followed that?
I haven't. I never heard about it actually. Were they just doing research? Or?
Yeah, it was a military ship one.
Oh, I haven't followed that. I have a sort of a relative that he works at University of Alabama, I believe, and he used to go down there annually. He actually wrote a book about it, and it was 2015 where he talked a lot about the changes that have happened, and a lot of it isn't good, like the climate and the invasive, the chemistry and the temperature has changed a lot.
Yeah, he's probably not allowed to talk about it anymore.
Well, I haven't talked to him. Yeah, I don't know what his situation is now, but I don't think it's probably.
Or else you'll
good.
find yourself reported
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah. Good. I don't even know what it would cost to do this trip now.
Is South Georgia a British area?
Yeah. Yeah. They actually had some Brits there, and they actually have a post office. In fact, I've got a postcard. We went in and they gave us a postcard. They actually have a postal stamp that says South Georgia. It's I don't know what they call it, a protectorate or something. It's the same status as the Falkland Islands and stuff. But yeah, there was 4 or 5 people that lived there. They're there 8-9 months of the year. They run the post office. I don't know. They just maintain. There's a museum, so they maintain that. Yes?
There's a lot of stories in the early expeditions there where things went awry.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any misadventure with any of these more frequent boats down in Antarctica?
When I wanted to go, I signed up for a boat that left in December, and that boat sunk.
Ooh.
It hit an iceberg and it sunk. Yeah.
Wow.
And I was on the waiting list. So it does happen. Yeah, it was, it was the MV Explorer, and it had been down there several times, and
with loss of life or?
No, they all survive, but the thing is, these ships, there's only ever one 4 hours away. There's always one 4 hours ahead of you and 4 hours
Oh.
behind. And we could always see one behind us. And they radioed us, where they said, good news and bad news is we've hit an iceberg, we are going to sink, but we got 2 hours, so get into a lifeboat. And some of them were 8, 10, 12 hours in lifeboats.
Oh,
And the next day, they all got rescued, and the next day a gale blew in, and they never would have been able to rescue them. They had calm seas overnight, and it wasn't that bad. And there was all kinds of ice, but they all got out.
yeah.
So
But
you,
3-4 hours later, there was a big storm came, and they wouldn't have made it.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
so you didn't change your mind after?
Well, I hadn't. I think I left in January, and that boat sunk about December 17th or something. So by the time we heard about it, and there was a ship. Yeah, in fact, when we were in Ushuaia, there was a big ship, like a 300-person, called the Fram, and there was a huge gash, and it hit an iceberg too. And you could see it. And I'd heard about that. That had happened about 3 months previous, and you could see that. I've got a photo of it. Yeah, when we were left the South Orkneys, we were going 3 kilometers an hour at night because we couldn't get out of the icebergs, and they were looking. Because if you're going fast, you're gonna sink. And they just slow with spotlights until they
Wow.
just try to get the hell out of them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's very, very real.
I'm gonna have to think about that overnight.
Yeah, because you can tell when you feel we're not going very fast. You can feel when the boat's going fast, and we got photos of them at night. And they're steering around them, and they're going as slow as they can, and trying to get out of there.
But you
Were
reckon,
you there for research, or was it
For fun, holiday.
Fun
Yeah,
holiday?
yeah. It was a lot of Canadians on there actually. And so Ian Sterling was on. Do you know him?
I don't know personally.
He was one of the guides.
Cool.
Yeah.
What was the company?
Well, I went with a British bird watching group, but we were just a dozen people that took 10 of the 100 spaces. But there was a Canadian company based in Calgary that had about 50 spots, and then quite a few Australians too.
Oh,
because there
okay, so the trip wasn't run by one organization?
Yeah, it was just, there was this
A
ship,
group?
and anybody that wanted a spot
Right.
could either contact, it was called Peregrine Tours. It was a Canadian-Australian company. You could just book a spot on the ship, and it didn't really matter who you were. And just a couple of Americans and a couple of Europeans, mostly Canadians and Australians. Yeah. Yeah. But it was good because most of the passengers weren't. We stood on the deck the entire time in
Yeah.
the rain and the snow, and we're watching birds and whales
Yeah.
the whole time. And
You weren't
most-
sitting in the bar all day?
No, never. Or very, very rarely.
so we recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was amazing. Yeah.
That's good.
I don't know if I'd go again because I saw almost everything that I wanted to see,
Yeah.
and I missed a couple things.
Yeah. Oh, that's very good.
Yeah.
It just gives a great picture of, well, exactly where you end up and what you see in different places, and just the cool variety of bird life, especially, and some of the scenery. And
Yeah.
I'm sure you could do this again with other pictures, and there's so much you see
Yeah.
on a trip like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we thank you very much. I don't know if you've already got one of the
I don't think
coveted
so.
and very useful
Oh.
Chignecto Naturalists Club's mugs. And you'll get more from us to thank you for that as well.
Oh, that's
than that.
amazing.
So we're so glad
Appreciate
for
it.
this presentation at last. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.